Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I must say I'm one of the members of the audience today who is here in Jakarta in Indonesia for the first time, and I personally can think of no better venue than to host the NewCities Summit because we are truly on the frontier of the urban moment and seizing the urban moment. And so it's my distinct pleasure this morning to lay out some of the themes of this year's summit, to really explain what the urban moment is, and to sort of unpack what we're going to discuss in the next 2 days. So I chose to sort of start this brief talk with an image here. This is a famous photograph by Tuca Vera, the Brazilian photographer. This is a shot from Sao Paulo. This, to me, sort of embodies the urban moment as it exists, where the developed world and the developing one sit cheek by jowl, where essentially we have taken the cores of cities and we are building projects that are inaccessible to them. And I don't believe that this model of urban development can be sustained for very long. It's a question of, this is what we have built. The question is, how can we do it better? The urban moment also means, in the sense of, as John referred to, as the governor referred to, that we are truly in an unprecedented age of building cities. We can literally see in photos like this, visualizations from space, how nation states cease to matter once we're actually looking at global scales. We're looking at networks of cities that are formed around the globe that we can see through air routes and trade routes, and of course the dense glowing cores visible from space. And so, we can talk about sort of urbanization rates. I want to talk a bit about some of the huge numbers that are involved here. So, particularly here in Southeast Asia, as John referred to, where the urban century is going to be a particularly Asian one, we can see in this brief chart here, with the exceptions of Indonesia and Malaysia, which have already become predominantly urbanized, more than half that way, major nations around Southeast Asia are still yet to reach that tipping point, of yet to seize their urban moment, and that's about to happen. In the next 30 years or so, we're going to see mass urbanization happen in all of these nations. And it's hard for us to really grasp what that means and what that looks like. But here's a few numbers. So, for example, India in 2050 will have an urban population alone of 800 million people, which is more than the entire populations today of Indonesia, the United States, and Brazil. Indonesia itself, of course, will have an urban population of 227 million by 2050, which is larger than the entire population today of just Brazil. India's numbers are hard to match. And even Thailand, for example, by 2050, it'll have a population of 44 million in its cities, which is still greater than the entire population of Argentina today, one of the great nations of the early 20th century. And what this also means is how they are spread out on the ground, what we are building right now. These are some satellite photos and data collected by my New York University colleague, Sally Angel, showing that essentially as we are urbanizing, we're building out further and further away from dense cores. So you can see on the left there, that's Thailand, starting from its historic core, massive sprawl into the countryside. Bandung here, just down the road, of course, just the last 10 years alone, or I'm sorry, the 10 years between 1991 and 2001, massive horizontal urbanization. Solly has this amazing statistic, the one that to me is the most significant of the century so far, is that in the first 50 years of this century, we are going to triple urban land cover. So everything we have built to this day in terms of cities will triple in size in just 50 years. This is truly an unprecedented moment, and how we build these cities could potentially decide everything. It will certainly decide economic growth, it will certainly decide how we build more inclusive societies, and how we move, live, work, and love. And these, of course, are really knotty challenges to deal with. This is a hand-drawn map that Solly prepared, Solly Angel at NYU, showing the Bangkok street grid around circa 1984. And the two things that he takes away from this are, one, most of these streets developed. They were the results of negotiations, where the actual landowners and the residents sat down and figured out how they would run the streets through these dense neighborhoods. This, of course, had great advantages in the sense of it corresponded to the reality of cities and how life is lived. But the other problem is that it didn't put in the actual avenues and circulators to allow traffic to move through it, which was why today Bangkok has some of the worst, most intractable traffic in the world. And this, to me, is interesting because the urban moment is one about what has been referred to as wicked problems. The German Horst Riddle and the English academic and urban planner Melvin Weber described wicked problems as problems that cannot be solved, they can only be managed. And the city is the ultimate example of this. We cannot actually solve for a perfect city. We can only try to grapple with the realities on the ground and the needs and wishes of residents and try to basically meet their desires coming from the bottom up with infrastructure from the top down. And wicked problems, of course, are most wicked because they can only be attempted to be managed once. There's only one shot we ever have at trying to create a right answer. The second moment we can talk about the urban moment here is that my other NYU colleague, Paul Romer, the economist, who spoke at last year's summit, has talked about that urbanization appears to be the one phenomenon that is universal to every developed society. We can talk about how various cultures develop, but urbanization is always key. This is a graph I borrowed from the World Bank showing that essentially every major society in the West and in the East reaches a moment where their core cities go through a massive period of densification, and then they reach their trajectory, and then they flatten out. And the key, of course, is to become rich and developed by the time that happens. And you can see this happening decade after decade, century over century, as it goes from there. And so it's impossible to take apart whether cities are caused by growth or whether urbanization itself causes growth, but we know that these two are entwined. It is impossible to grow and become a developed society without urbanization and vice versa. And so this is why seizing the urban moment is a particular challenge here. And of course, the third major moment here is going to be climate change. It is going to be the risks that we face in a rapidly warming world. This is, of course, the Philippines after the super typhoon of several years ago. Just this morning, the first person I met at this year's summit was an urban planner from the Philippines who was talking about the various zoning techniques that they've been forced to adopt and actually relocating people away from coastlines in an attempt to grapple with these changes. Cities will be the front lines of both mitigation, where we will attempt to rein in our carbon emissions. We've seen this in networks of cities like C40 and elsewhere. And also, of course, the front lines of adaptation. Rising sea levels, which appear destined to happen by every single respected scientist, shows that we'll have massive urban populations in the billions that will be the first ones to feel the brunt of rising sea levels. And of course, there's also massive changes in the urban moment for governance. You've already heard today through John and others about, we're talking about devolution. We're talking about the fact that mayors effectively are ruling the world. The president in that photo, of course, sets policy at the national level, but mayors are the ones who are delivering services to you and the ones grappling with these governance challenges. This is going to lead to all sorts of changes required in how we actually see cities, not just as political units, but as social and economic ones. And we've barely begun grappling with how do we actually realign these two. But the most important thing about cities, the thing that makes me really passionate about them, the most important part of the urban moment, is what a city is. So several years ago, a couple of physicists in the United States, Jeffrey West and Luis Betancourt, and Jeff spoke again at last year's summit, tried to figure out what is it that makes cities so special, because they had organized all these data sets and found that cities were not biological creatures. They actually got bigger and better as the faster they grew. And so we could see here, that basically what Luis Betancourt, the younger of the two, has argued, is that cities are something special. They're what he calls social reactors. Well, I lost a slide there. That essentially cities are suns, they're stars. They are where we take social networks and condense them in space and time, and something magical happens. That's where we see massive profusions and growth. That's where we see jobs created. That's where we see basically development happen as it happens in the forms of cities. And so I want to talk a bit about today, and sort of concluding in this, about a right that has been neglected, I think, in cities, or something that's been left out of the urban discussion the last few years. And it's what's been called the right to the city. It was coined by a French philosopher, Henri Lefebvre, and taken up by the English economic geographer David Harvey. The freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves is, I want to argue, one of our most precious yet neglected of our human rights. Having access to cities, having access to the transformative energies at their cores, which produces all these great effects, is one of the most important things we can do in the city and how we're truly going to seize this urban moment. And so I want to talk about sort of three aspects involved in creating the right to the city and establishing that right. Public spaces, mobility, and recognizing that cities are often built by hand. So when it comes to public spaces, this is the center of Madrid, 15th of May, 2011. Really the forerunner of the Occupy movement in the United States and around the world, and of course also the Arab Spring. It was here that thousands of people spontaneously gathered for protests, and then a small core of them stayed. They occupied the piazza, and of course similar actions happened in Barcelona and Seville, and really became the foundation of a movement against austerity. And so this is a photo in 2013 of a woman named Ada Colau, who was in this photo being removed from an anti-austerity occupation of a bank. And on Saturday, she is going to be sworn in as the mayor of Barcelona. I think this is really significant in the sense of that, particularly in Spain, where movements like Podemos have happened, is we've actually seen the energies of Occupy and the Arab Spring have really been channeled into democratic politics, where really the discussions and the contested spaces there have really flowed back into governance. And so I think this is one of the most powerful things of public spaces. You'll also hear this afternoon from my friend Marcus Westbury from Australia about a project he initiated there called Renew Newcastle, where basically they took over vacant spaces in the city's core of Newcastle, Australia, and made it a place where artists and creators and entrepreneurs could take over these vacant spaces with the permission of landlords and really turn it into something special there. And so I love this notion that the public space, the public realm, goes beyond just the piazzas, but goes into the urban fabric, and how do we make more of it? Now, mobility is an interesting word, particularly in English, because mobility has three meanings now for me. One, of course, is transportation. One, of course, are the mobile devices that we have in our pockets, all of our phones. And, of course, the third meaning is economic and social mobility. And all three of those meanings have become entwined. So this is a photograph taken in Sao Paulo 2 years ago, where we had a summit then. One of the NewCities Summits was held there. Mere weeks after the summit concluded, where we talked about the importance of transportation infrastructure and accessibility and how we structured these things, a fare increase in the Sao Paulo transit system led to massive riots. And the reason, of course, is because in Sao Paulo, as I'm sure many of you are aware here in Jakarta and other cities like Bangkok, there are many on the urban periphery who have to commute for hours to have access to the urban core, to have access to jobs and those transformative energies I talked about. Their right to the city was impinged upon by the fact that it took them so long to get there. And so, of course, what I love about this photo is that simply boarding a metro becomes a rebellious act. And of course, this is some other work that we've done at NYU, is we've actually seen how entwined mobility and opportunity is. This is some data we show that basically that the wealthiest neighborhoods in New York are the ones that have the greatest number of jobs that are accessible by transit or by walking. And those who are in the least privileged areas in New York are the ones who are most dependent on the car. And so my boss at New York University, Mitchell Moss, has said that in our case, having a transit card is more important than a college education when it comes to your opportunity in New York City. And I think that's very powerful, and I think that's why, as the governor talked about earlier, how we build out BRT and the MRT here in cities like Jakarta is going to be one of the most powerful infrastructure projects we can undertake. And also how we can basically entwine all sorts of informal transit, the transit exists here, but that is often sort of hidden in the shadows, how we can integrate that into our public transit systems, how we can actually build more flexible, more powerful transit to increase the right of the city for many. And the final thing I want to talk about briefly here is the notion of how we build our cities. So, here at the NewCities Foundation, I've been to many NewCities Summits here and in King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, and it's our natural response that we need to respond to this challenge, of tripling urban land cover, that we will build massive new cities from scratch, including this one. This is going to be the unnamed capital of Cairo that was unveiled in March, a $45 billion project, an entirely new satellite city. You're going to hear from its architect, Peter Gandrill, from Skidmore, Owings & Merrill in one of this morning's sessions. And of course, there's cities like this being built all around the world, BSD here in Jakarta and others. This is not the complete solution, of course, to how we're going to address this. The problem traditionally with building new cities from scratch is igniting that, that social reactor in the core. It's often a difficult undertaking. It takes decades. And if we're really going to actually sort of create a real opportunity for millions of people who live in cities and seize the urban moment, we're going to need to recognize and dignify the people who are, of course, building their own homes by hand, the informal settlements that occupy cities. We're going to need to figure out ways in which we can bring infrastructure down to them and allow them the room and the resources to build their own cities. Because this is, of course, how cities have always developed. And I was taught this lesson by a pair of young architects who were based in Mumbai, in Dharavi, the world's most infamous slum, made famous by Slumdog Millionaire, the film. And they like to talk about the fact that this is how cities have always developed. And so this is actually two cities. This is actually Tokyo on the left, and this is Dharavi on the right. And the reason they talk about Tokyo is, of course, because Tokyo, after World War II, after the United States firebombed it, was basically a gigantic informal settlement. There, the government actually recognized that they did not have the resources coming out of the war to rebuild everything themselves, and so they actually allowed people to start carving out spaces to rebuild their homes. And it actually led to this sort of urban form. And this is other Photoshop composites that these gentlemen have done. Matthias Echenove and Rahul Srivastava of the studio Herbs. That's Dharavi on the left and Barcelona on the right. And then, of course, there's my last one here. This is the medieval city of Perugia in Italy on the left, and then Dharavi on the right. And so the reason I want to conclude with these images, I want you to think back to what I showed you at the very beginning, right, of the favelas in Sao Paulo, next, cheek by jowl, to the luxury high-rise there. And to me, what's interesting about that photo is there's absolutely no possible way to imagine how that favela on the left will evolve into that high-rise on the right. Seizing the urban moment and reestablishing our right to the city is going to need creation of spaces like this where we can actually see the evolution by many, many hands into the kind of cities that we know and love. And so for the next 2 days, and the many speakers who are here, I hope we can talk about these processes, and I hope we can actually chart out a path to a more sustainable future. So thank you very much.